This is a tale of World War I bravery. The background to the tale was given to the storyteller John Smith by his oldest brother David, who is now 80. The beginning took place when David was quite young. That would be about the time of the start of the Second World War.
His father Alex had taken him on a visit to the Port Glasgow War Memorial. He pointed out a name, David Smith. He told David that this was whom he had been named after, David Haldane Smith. David was a great-uncle who had died in November 1914 fighting with the King's Own Scottish Borderers. David, John's brother, wanted more information about his namesake. David's death interested John, but for a few years, till he retired, he could not look into this. Then, by fortune, John was in Berwick-on-Tweed and could visit the King's Own Scottish Borderers Museum.
John met the curator in his tiny office. John gave him David's regimental number, 7420, and the curator found David in the record. John had questions from his own research, but one important one stood out. David had been born in 1876, so he would have gone to war in 1914, aged 38. Why? The curator found that David had first enlisted in 1901. He most probably enlisted for 5 years in the regulars and then spent 7 years in the reserves.
His 5 years would have been eventful. If he was originally in the 2nd Battalion, as John suspected, he would have served in Dinajapur in 1901. He would have moved to Burma in 1903 and Memo in 1904. In 1906, he would have served in Aden, then home to Glasgow and back to civilian life.
After the travelling, David would have left the regulars and gone back into shipbuilding in one of the yards, probably Russell's across the street. He would have remained in the Army Reserves for 7 years. In 1911, David appears in the British census, where we can see his civilian lifestyle. He is a shipwright, aged 35, and married to Agnes Renfrew. He lives with Agnes in 13 Mary Street in Port Glasgow, and they have one child after 14 years of marriage, Haldane Smith.
Hugh was to become a personality in town as he played in various positions for Greenock Morton from about 1930 till just before the Second World War. He lived at 6 Bruce Street in Port Glasgow. This by chance is only 2 closes from where John's own family lived, Alec and David, and where John himself was born at 8 Bruce Street. David was a member of Newark Chapel of Ease and a firm member of the Jacobite cause, with their strong stance against alcohol. David in 1913 would have been free of his delegation after 7 years in the reserves.
On August the 4th, 1914, war was declared. Each day onward, many men were enlisted who had been regulars. David was signed up, as all reservists were. By the 8th of August 1914, because John found David had registered a soldier's will, by the 8th, he was sent along with other reservists in the town, firstly to barracks at the King's Own Scottish Borderers at Berwick, and then to Dublin, where the 2nd Battalion was based.
There they were organised into part of the British Expeditionary Forces under Sir John French. They became part of the 13th Brigade of the 5th Division of the 2nd Corps. David was shipped to France on August the 13th on the SS Gloucestershire and landed on August 15th at Le Havre. The BEF was sent by train to fight at Mons in Belgium on August the 22nd to hold up the German advance.
When war had broke out, the Germans were planning to implement the Schlieffen Plan. This was simply designed to surprise the French and get the war in the West over quickly. The Germans were to sweep through Belgium, round the French defensive line to the west of Paris, fast enough to capture the city and France. This would then free troops for Germany's war with Russia in the east. It started well as a plan, but kept getting bogged down.
Fighting at Liège in Belgium slowed the Germans, as did the fight at Mons, where David was at the very front. The troops were greatly outnumbered, but saved the day by their sharp shooting. Mons lasted only a few days, and then the British Expeditionary Force and the French retreated towards Paris. A successful rearguard action at Le Cateau bought the Allies time. David fought in this again, and at the very front against even higher odds. Eventually the French and British stopped retreating on September the 6th and faced the Germans less than 50 miles from Paris.
Paris was under threat. Transportation was vital for defence. One French general commandeered all the taxis in Paris to move troops to the front and help save Paris. The French general Joffre used early aircraft to spot an advantage that he could exploit. His reconnaissance spotted that the Germans had left a gap between two armies. The British Expeditionary Force and the French moved forward to split the German armies at the Battle of the Marne and won the day. This destroyed the Schlieffen Plan. The defeated Germans retreated to the north side of the River Aisne. They were chased by the French and the British Expeditionary Force. Across the river, the Germans dug the first permanent trenches of the war. This halted the Allies' forward thrust, and the fighting ended in a stalemate.
From then, the generals on both sides tried to outmaneuver each other by outflanking their opponents on their western flank. This resulted in a series of battles starting near the River Aisne and swiftly moving up towards the North Sea ports. These flanking and outflanking manoeuvres were the tactics used in the race to the sea. David was carried by bus and train from near Aisne to Belgium to fight and fulfil his fate.
So the 13th Brigade had fought in all the large battles from the middle of August to October. They had seen since August the 22nd defeat, retreat and victory. They had travelled more than 150 miles on train, bus and on foot. During the 8th and 9th October 1914, 2nd Corps, in which the King's Own Scottish Borderers served under General Smith-Dorrien, detrained at Abbeville, having been brought up from the Battle of Aisne. The Battle of La Bassée started on the 12th of October and would last till the 2nd of November. It was part of the race to the sea, and it was among the last of a series of mobile battles. It would end in static trench warfare, being fully adopted for the rest of the war.
David and his fellow troops were attacking the western flank of the German forces in late October near Neuve-Chapelle. On the 31st of October, David and his patrol were involved in the Battle of Messines in Belgium. It was just south of the battle being fought for the strategic town of Ypres. Out of curiosity, it was a battle that a certain Austrian corporal, Adolf Hitler, took part in.
John obtained the war diary of the King's Own Scottish Borderers 2nd Battalion for the 2 fateful days of the 31st of October and November 1st, 1914. At 11 a.m. on the 31st, the Cavalry Corps were holding onto a north to south line through the village of Wulvergem to the west of the town of Messines.
The King's Own Scottish Borderers were asked to attack on the south end of the line and the King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry to the north to retake trenches that had been lost. The King's Own Scottish Borderers pushed to the east of the village, clearing the Germans from the convent and the church. With the bayonet and sharp shooting, the Germans held on and at the end of the day still held good positions up to the centre line held by the cavalry.
On the 1st of November at dawn, the troops in the centre line in the village needed additional assistance as the Germans had fallen back behind their left flank, making them vulnerable. 2 platoons of the King's Own Scottish Borderers were dispatched to assist the troops. The village troop commander gave a provisional order for all forward troops to retire, and D Company of the King's Own Scottish Borderers took the covering position to let this happen. During the day, as the order was provisional, all the troops did not retire. They thought they could hold on to the ground won, as the German advance had been thought to have been checked.
The Royal Artillery, however, thought complete retirement had taken place and proceeded to shell the village and the King's Own Scottish Borderers with high explosive shells. These fell on to David and the platoon who were located in village houses. They all died. So David and his compatriots were casualties of friendly fire.